Hello and welcome to the weird and wonderful world of children, explained by scientists. It is brought to you by the Development of Educational Science Group from Goldsmith University and by Baby Brains, the bridge between parents and society. I am Dr. Sylvia Dalvit and I am the scientific director of Baby Brains. And from Goldsmith, we have today Dr. Teemu Toivinen, who is going to talk to us about creativity today. Teemu, thank you very much for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sylvia, for your introduction and greetings for everybody from sunny London. It's very nice to be here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And sorry, everyone, for being a little bit late, but technology wasn't helping today. We managed in the end with perseverance. We are here. And we can't wait to hear about creativity and its place in education. It's quite interesting because we've talked about creativity last week with Professor Teresa Farroni. And 50% of our listeners have already looked at our previous video. But 60% of you still think that toddlers are more creative than teenagers. So you need to go and listen again. But everyone agrees that creativity does have an important role to play in education. So we can't wait to listen to you, Teemu, and to hear about creativity in education.
Excellent. So maybe just to give a bit of context where I'm coming from, maybe in this presentation and how it might link to the presentation from last week. So if I would have to put myself into a sort of box, I probably would define myself as a creativity researcher. So I'm interested in trying to understand what is creativity as a concept, also how we can measure it, if any kind of these creativity measurements, if they are useful in real life applications, for example, can they predict different kind of behaviors, etc. And I've done also some work looking at specific creativity aspects in childhood and how it relates to the educational achievement. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit. But I would also say that this talk, talking about creativity in education, it is quite broad in a way that I refer creativity as a quite broad construct, but also education in a quite diverse way. So my own experience in teaching comes from the higher education, so university levels. But of course, if we compare education at different levels, there are huge variation, and a lot of this knowledge is embedded for the educational practitioners who work in the different levels as well. But having said this, hopefully this will give you a bit of food for thought or any kind of comments or questions. So it will be very fantastic to hear in the end the views from the audience. What do you think? Or if you have any further questions you like to clarify. But just to sort of summarize the main points or topics that I'd like to cover today. So few words, what are the sort of perhaps broad benefits of talking about or try to apply creativity in education? But then we go back to this sort of million-dollar question, what is creativity? And I think hopefully by the end of the session, you have a bit of critical view when you hear the word creativity in relation to educational discourse. A few words on this very famous soundbite by Ken Robinson when he emphasizes the relevance of creativity in educational systems and further down that perhaps schools or formalized education can be detrimental for creativity. So maybe we can try to sort of decompose or bring more sort of flair for these statements as well. And then in the end, of course, because this is very applied, interesting topic, there are some points that might be sort of useful, interesting for people who work in education, but of course, parents who are maybe thinking of how to incorporate creativity in upbringing, etc. So just to talk about the benefits of creativity in a societies as whole, sort of a big policy organization such as World Economic Forum has highlighted that creativity is one of the top skills in the future workforce. workforce. So as you can see here in the sort of report, they listed skills such as complex problem solving, critical thinking, and creativity to be very important in the future workforce. So it is up on the agenda in sort of professional bodies as well. And similarly, OECD has conducted or put together many reports and different kind of events where they bring together educators, policymakers, researchers to talk about the creativity. So creativity is recognized in many different kind of aspects, but often the problem comes how we talk about creativity. What does it mean? Because creativity can mean so many different things for different people and different stakeholders. But also, of course, when we talk about creativity in relation to individuals, or in this case, it would be children, students in school, there are sort of plenty of personal, individual reasons why to engage with creative thinking, creative activities. And there are several empirical studies that have concluded that creativity, engagement with creative activities in comparison perhaps with other activities seems to sort of increase happiness, activity, and perhaps have linked it for the better psychological health. So these would be probably sort of easy ways to argue why creative exploration, creative thinking would be beneficial for individual students as well. But this leads to the question. So, what is creativity then? What do we mean when we talk about creativity in educational context? And I think one way how we can sort of try to get our head around with this concept of creativity is perhaps to look at the ways it's often talked about. So often in everyday speak, we might think about it as a binary characteristic. So for example, we might think that one of our students is creative versus maybe some other who is non-creative. Also, another misconceptions or the way we talk about creativity is to view it as a fixed characteristic. Maybe say that, it is due to the sort of, I don't know, genetic influences, and they have been very creative, this person, since I know them, etc. And also another misconception or reason why there might be confusion when talking about the creativity is that we often relate it to specific domains or areas, such as art instead of science. And I provide some counter argument why these sort of statements or way to talk about creativity might be misleading. So if we start off with the sort of binary characteristic of creativity, we should recognize that creativity is not sort of like either or, but it also changes through the individual lifespan. Some individuals sort of find perhaps their creativity at different points of life. They didn't even realize that would be something that would interest them. And this is also shown by certain theoretical models or frameworks for creativity, such as so-called 4C model of creativity. And many of you may have heard before of big C and little c creativity. And this refers to this kind of eminent creative behaviors like, I don't know, winning Nobel Prize or making sort of a groundbreaking artwork versus sort of everyday creative activities, which would be sort of everyday exploration, maybe applying our creative skills in social interactions, maybe having some kind of creative artistic hobbies, etc. as well. So often, especially when we make comparisons, it might be easy to compare somebody who has won a Nobel Prize to somebody who just write poems to their drawer. And I think it wouldn't be necessarily fair or very informative to compare sort of creative behaviors at different levels. And this also relates very closely to ideas from Margaret Bowden, who studied sort of artificial intelligence, computational creativity. And she argues, or she has this concept of psychological and historical creativity, which means that sort of exploring, for example, creative behaviors of children through the development, they will also give us indications of how creative ideas may come in the higher level, in this big C level. So she's arguing that there are similar kind of processes taking in place. So in that sense, if this would be the case, we would be able to also explore higher level creativity, focusing on these everyday creative behaviors. And Beckett and Kaufman, they have also sort of provided further information, further stages for this model. So they have also separated so-called mini-C, which refers to the sort of subjective experiences when taking part in creative activities, and also pro-C, which refers to sort of more professional creative activities, which haven't sort of yet reached eminent stages. So this would give the indication that creativity is not either or. There are different levels related to different domains taking place perhaps at different stages in our lifespan. Also, another sort of misconception that might also feed into how we view creativity in education is that it would be somehow a fixed, deterministic sort of characteristic. And there's quite a bit of empirical evidence based on twin studies that have shown, unsurprisingly perhaps, as is the case with most psychological constructs, that the variation between individuals, so why do we differ in various different creativity characteristics, it's due both genetic and environmental effects. So it's interplay between those two factors. It is not that there would be specific genes that would determine someone to be creative. That is false. That is a misconception. So it's very important to get that straight. So there are environmental forces that come into play in the interactions with the certain genetic predisposition. And also, as a sort of last point, that creativity would be associated with certain disciplines or domains, for example, only in arts, not in science. I think one way to tackle this kind of contradiction would be to think about creativity embedded in certain cognitive processes. So in creativity research, we talk about creative cognition that would relate to specific cognitive processes, such as divergent thinking, conceptual expansion, and overcoming knowledge constraints. So it would be sort of think about open-endedly, think about it, alternative uses, sort of stretching our maybe more sort of logical, rational thinking. And of course, these kind of cognitive processes, they are not only related to art, but they are also something that we could apply in sciences. So in that respect, maybe this would be a good starting point. Try to think about creativity in education and specifically narrow it down for these specific cognitive processes and perhaps how they could be incorporated in learning. But all this is sort of down to the perhaps quite vague way of defining creativity. So the most commonly used standard definition of creativity refers creativity requiring both originality and effectiveness. So in order for something to be creative, it needs to have this kind of original value. So it needs to be statistically quite rare, unusual. However, it also needs to fit some kind of purpose. So it sort of have some kind of I would say like reason to exist. It needs to be effective, and this might be something when we, for example, think about younger children who can very easily associate very weird things together and produce a lot of very, very creative ideas, original ideas perhaps. But those ideas are not necessarily filling any kind of gap. So it's not like, or they are producing these ideas in order to solve the problem. They are just producing these ideas because they are making random associations, which is fantastic. And it's something that, in a way, perhaps as we get older, we forget or we unlearn in a way. However, I would say that, of course, it's not creative. It's not only producing these very fantastic original ideas, but it needs to have this relevance as well. So maybe that is sort of balancing act when we look at creative idea production at different ages as well. But this sort of the role of this kind of creative cognition, creativity, it has been highlighted in education, and there is a lot of opinion pieces like this editorial opinion in The Guardian in 2019, where they were sort of emphasizing or making the case that perhaps creativity is missing in current educational system. And there is also recent review on creativity assessment by Long et al. And one of the arguments they proposed is that globally creativity is not very well included in sort of educational practices. Which leads to the very famous soundbite that the schools or educational system kills creativity. And as I mentioned before, this was sort of made famous by late Sir Ken Robinson, who gave his TED talk, I think, sort of mid-2000, 2005, maybe something like this, which has been viewed probably like almost 100 millions of times. And his sort of underlying argument was that the creativity should be viewed as important in education as literacy. But then I think this soundbite that the school skill creativity has sort of taken its wings, and it's you can see it popping up everywhere. However, I would say that we should be perhaps a little bit critical about it, because if we just sort of repeat the phrase school skill creativity, it's giving maybe undermining the efforts of current education system, schools and teachers who probably are doing their best in order to encourage also creativity as much as they can. But just to relate this point to one of the studies that I conducted with my collaborators, where we were looking at the relationship between creativity and later educational achievement. So in this study, we were able to use data for a longitudinal study in the UK called Twins Early Development Study. And this study, which is based in King's College London, initiated by Professor Robert Blomin, is fantastic. It is a large-scale representative sample of the population of England and Wales. And because the data collection started in mid-90s, and some of the participants are still taking part in this study, there's a massive amount of data that has been accumulated over the years. And in our study, the data that we used for the creativity assessment were based on children's stories when they were 9 years old. And in this story, they saw these 3 images as shown on the slide and asked to tell a story based on these images to be as funny or creative as they can. And I remember when we started the project, I saw these images. I was expecting that it's going to be probably quite similar descriptive narrative. There are pigs and bats and hawks in a farm. But it was so fantastic to see the diversity of children telling about what's happening in these images. And some of them were also very funny or even very dark. I remember the example of somebody talking about Mr. and Mrs. Pig ending up being Mr. and Mrs. Bacon and Sausage or something. So they were sort of dark features in some of the stories, which was fantastic as well. But in our study, what we did based on these stories using the method called the consensual assessment technique, we were able to give stories a sort of creativity score. And then through the statistical analysis, we used this creativity score at age 9, and we found that it can predict variance in end of the school English exams at age 16. And what made this finding interesting, that in this statistical model, we also included information about the previous school grades and other psychological measures. And based on this association that we found, we sort of speculated that perhaps it could be that this kind of creative expressiveness, for example, in childhood storytelling, is not something that is incorporated in a formal assessment at that age. And therefore, it wasn't picked up by these English grades at age 9 in the statistical model. And what makes this finding fascinating, I'd argue, is that perhaps how it feeds into the educational practice, or how students feel about their own abilities. Like if you're age 9, you are very imaginative, creative storyteller, But when you write these stories, maybe your technical skills are not so developed, and you get quite a poor grades, mainly because the grades are, for a reason, focusing more on your technical skills, not your storytelling abilities. And hence, based on this, you might think about like, oh, maybe this is not really a thing for me, and that might sort of like divert your interest. This is only speculation, so can't so be so like too certain about it, but this seems to come from our data. And also another sort of potential creativity killer in current, at least compulsory education, could be the amount of assessment. And this relates to the link that has been shown with especially intrinsic motivation, so enjoyment and curiosity to do something in relation to creativity. And it has been shown in several creativity papers that when we have sort of somebody's examining us or testing us, it's not good for creativity. So hence, in order to try to encourage our school children or students to produce something creative while we are timing and monitoring them, it is probably not very sort of useful or ecologically a valid way to do it. And then, of course, when we have standardized assessments and also sort of evaluation of school performance, maybe in a national levels as well, this would limit what teachers feel that they can do. If their main aim is to make sure that students perform as well as they can in the standardized assessment, it doesn't give too much room for any kind of creative exploration. So it is sort of more systematic processes that come into play, which may not be so beneficial for creative exploration. And that leads to also to the lack of opportunities for trial and error. Also, another sort of maybe broad point, which might be a creativity killer, is that we have to recognize individual differences in our skills and preferences. And this relates very importantly for creative thinking activities, but of course, any kind of sort of skill development, I'd argue. And there are these ideas, like very old ideas from the sort of 18th century already, that the schools could be some kind of garden in which children would be able to grow in their own unique ways. But of course, this is so much more easier said than done. And it's not going to happen if we don't produce resources for education. So we can ask for more creativity in education. We can argue more individual education. But if we don't have enough money, space, teachers, it's never going to happen. And this is sort of something that Mary Boosted, who's been sort of heading to one of the teachers' union as well, and written a book about the teacher retention crisis. It's also a sort of a political issue which is currently in the news in the UK at least. But also we might want to recognize that not all students want to engage with the creative cognition as well. So it shouldn't be that we would have to force this kind of thinking activities for each single student in education as well. And again, when we talk about creativity in more applied settings, we would have to have much better definitions, which would be more meaningful, so that they could be also applied in educational practice. But there are like some suggestions in the literature from the researchers that maybe might be beneficial for schools or teachers if they want to look at sort of some kind of ideas. Again, these are coming from the researchers, not necessarily from the practicing educators. So as said before, it's easier said than done. But it would be probably by providing opportunities for choice and discovery and the use imagination while learning. Also, this kind of risk-taking, which is often put on the side when we aim to, as said before, or maybe getting good grades in standardized assessment. So we would have to, as educators, consciously give space and opportunities for students to try and fail, and then give reasoning also why it is good to fail in sometimes in order to sort of explore different kind of ideas. And of course, it's good to not to try to assess and evaluate and criticize student ideas, especially in the initial stages, in order for them to sort of organically grow and explore it further. I was also sort of thinking just some kind of idea that might be beneficial for parents who might be thinking of or interested how to perhaps help their kids to be more creative. And there's this fantastic article in the New York Times a couple of years ago where Adam Grant, who's also a psychologist, gave this sort of very easy tip, and the argument would be how to raise a creative child. Step 1, back off. And I think he makes this very nice argument that if we talk about creativity, not specific skills, which can be sort of trained through a lot of practice, but creativity, it's very important that the children have this kind of intrinsic motivation, interest, and enjoyment to take part in these activities. And I think there needs to be a little bit of trust to sort of let the children or students to sort of find their own way and sort of test and try what they feel most enthusiastic to engage with, because nobody's gonna spend sleepless nights thinking about creative ideas if they are not embedded and interested in the topic. And I think there is this famous quote. Some people say it's from the Einstein, but I've been trying to sort of see if it's true. It's probably not, but still it's sort of quite an interesting quote that creativity is perhaps intelligence having fun. So I think when it comes to creative activities, creative thinking, creative exploration, we should not overlook the element of fun and enjoyment. So that was my talk, hopefully providing some ideas, think about creativity and education. So thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to hear some comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Toivinen. This has been really, really helpful. And also thank you for defining creativity, and that really allowed us to see how much freedom we need to allow to the person. That if we want someone to be creative, we cannot induce it, but we can make sure we don't kill it. And so that's already a very good and helpful advice for many parents, especially I think nowadays as parents, we tend to be quite worried about the future of our children, and we want them to have all those cognitive abilities that are supposed to give them access to jobs. And I love creativity because it's the one that is untamed. We cannot train that, right? By definition, we can make space for it. So I guess that's a big take-home message for parents. Our community had a few questions for you. So one is, what brought you to Goldsmith? Like, we want with the Weird and Wonderful world of children, we also want to build a bridge between scientists and parents. We want to kind of feel that we can help each other, and that there are a lot of things that interest us both, and that we can mutually enrich each other fields and practices. And so we're curious about you as a person as well. So what brought you there?
Yeah, so I in a way, I probably ended up sort of being at Goldsmiths. It was sort of not sort of straightforward progression. So I'm also a trained chef. So I was working in the kitchen for 15 years, and I'm sort of of course, looking back and think about it, what sort of made me sort of think about creativity at the time, and sort of in my current research, I'm sort of especially interested how we combine different kind of ideas, and more remote they are at bringing something new. And I remember when working in the kitchen, when we were coming up with the new recipes, for example, or new dishes, there seems to be, I find it differences in sort of based on the experience. So when you had sort of young chefs and they were coming up with something new, they pick up very sort of random things, put them together and offered them as something very, very unique. And most of them, they were just horrible. It just didn't work. But whereas more experienced chefs, when they do the same thing and combine flavors, they don't know sort of how to balance the the sort of weirdest or distance to make it work. And I have to say also, as a sort of anecdotal experience, it used to be young male chefs who were very ambitious and proud, bringing this kind of very weird dishes to the head chef and say like, "Oh, try, this is great, this is great." So there was this kind of like a lot of confidence in their own capacity as well. So there was a bit of this kind of understanding, like how we create something new of what is existing already. And then when I sort of started my sort of like psychological academic career, I was first interested in sort of like more of the cognitive abilities, personality. But I think sort of creativity, it's added sort of like an additional element that often is overlooked, perhaps in a more traditional intelligence or cognitive ability research, for reasons that it's not usually measured as part of the sort of construct of intelligence, and that relates problems with the sort of definitions and difficulties to measuring creativity as well.
Yeah. Yes, because
Can I just one, if you don't mind, like, or just adding one more point? I have to say, Goldsmiths is fantastic place to study creativity in psychology as well, because the college is sort of has a lot of art and design subjects, so it's sort of a very good place for the different sort of interdisciplinary research and collaborations as well.
yeah, this is fantastic. A chef become a psychologist. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, I can still make very nice cakes, so to speak.
Yes. Oh, when can I come over?
Anytime.
Yeah, this sounds fantastic, and it also, I think, it also shows that some creativity on your part with our own life. Like now, we tend to have long professional lives, in which actually we can make big changes, and sometimes things that look very very different on the surface might not be that different, and there are skills we develop in one area that can be very very useful in other areas. So I think that's very encouraging from that personal perspective as well. Yeah, going back to schools and education, and we were thinking education in a way could be seen even as the exact opposite of creativity, in the sense that education is maybe that, you know, the current, like, generation of, I don't know, 30 plus year old always feel like they have so much wisdom to pass on to the next generation. And I mean, this is what's so special about humans, that we can do that, and this creates this very fast progress, and it's amazing. So in a way, this is what we want to hand down to children. So when it comes to that part, we don't particularly want them to be creative. We want them to listen and learn what other people have found out before. And yet, so that urge is there, and every parent probably has experienced it, every teacher as well. And yet we are all convinced that creativity does have a space in that context. And how do you see that space?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a very valid point, and of course I think sort of I don't see it either or. I think, of course, if we would think about education only about transferring information or knowledge, that would be very static, and there wouldn't be any kind of change. So I think sort of expanding what is already there, the information, and also maybe making different kind of association, combination, interpret in a creative way, it sort of feeds into the building up more knowledge and understanding of the world as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they wouldn't be sort of in a way contradicting arguments, and perhaps maybe that is the thing that it is highlighted in the World Economic Forum as well. Like, the information is quite easy to sort of perhaps externalize to a certain extent, and sort of we can, with the computer's power, we can easily sort of play around, combine it in a different ways as well. But I think this kind of creative thinking skills, they are very beneficial in order for us to not generate it, but sort of organize and see connections between different kind of information as well.
Yeah. And from the point of view of a child, what's the difference between being creative and being easily distracted? It's a fine line.
Yeah, I think that's probably the, again, like, a tricky question, and something that many parents and teachers would be happy to sort of differentiate. I think there is a lot of overlap, and I suppose, like, or as we were talking about earlier, especially for the younger kids, it might be that, or you sort of see something and that initiates your train of thought, and it just doesn't stop because it just keep on going. So I think maybe sort of as children grow older, they start to see, when it comes to like creative thinking, the relevance of having this kind of effective or useful element as well. So they should be able to produce a lot of fantastic ideas, but then they would be also able to evaluate and maybe pick up the most useful one, instead of just constantly producing more and more information. So sometimes you have to be able to draw it back and select what is the most useful that sort of fits the whatever task or problem you may have at the time as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
Yes, absolutely. You were mentioning in your presentation as well the importance of the creation as something that answers a question or solves a problem or fills a gap, or it's not just random.
Exactly.
So yeah. And then I guess there was one more question that came from our community, and it was so everybody loves creativity. I don't think I ever heard someone saying, "Oh no, creativity is not my thing," or everybody sees that as a value, and yet it's very difficult to see it encouraged, or to, like, in creativity for the one who's not creating, for the ones that are around, can be a bit of an annoying thing as well, because you don't have control to that person who is creating. You don't know what's coming out, you don't know how long it's going to take. It's kind of difficult to encapsulate. So yeah, what's the balance there?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and sort of maybe that also relates to the point when it comes to education, the recognition that, especially if we sort of aim for the more individualized education, not everybody has to be creative. And in a way, it's okay for some students, for example, feel more comfortable doing something very logical, in a sort of steps that are expected, then sort of like explore sort of fantasy creative ideas as well. And I agree with you. I remember when I was starting doing creative research as well, I was slightly annoyed of this kind of maybe characterization of, oh, I'm being creative. In a way, it was just like having this kind of positive value without having too much meaning into it. And therefore, I think sort of really trying to think about, what do we mean by creativity, not as a label for the individual, but what are those underlying cognitive processes that relate to it, and how we can sort of tap into them, and sort of not just maybe go down the rabbit hole and say, like, oh, if somebody says, for example, this domain is creative and this is not, is that really the case? So we should be able to critically evaluate the whole concept of creativity as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving us such a refreshing view on creativity. So just to conclude, if you had just one thing to say to all parents and teachers about creativity, what would that be?
This probably sort of relates more on sort of like our personal experiences, etc. I would say that perhaps if possible, if you have opportunities and resources, just try to expose the students or children for many different kind of diverse experiences, and maybe as an adult be aware of your own biases. So in a way, like, or let the kids or students explore themselves and find what is their own interest, instead of your try to expose what do you think would be the most suitable for them.
Thank you so much. So we're gonna step back.
I have to put sort of like just a disclaimer. I don't have kids, so yeah, again, easier said than done.
Thank you so very much for this really interesting and exciting conversation. We really hope to have you back soon, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sylvia. It's been a pleasure. So thank you so much for having me. And I look forward for the upcoming talks at Baby Brains as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Teemu.
Excellent. Bye.